Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to give just a few moments for people to filter in here. Just see. Great. Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rohini Singh, and I am the Assistant Director of the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children of New York. Today, we will be discussing accessing behavioral health supports for students in schools. So welcome, everyone. Thank you again for being here. Thank you for joining. Just some logistical notes as we wait for people to filter in. I'm going to wait until the end of the presentation to answer specific questions, but feel free through the course of the presentation to use the Q&A feature as different questions come up on different things that I'm discussing or mentioning. There are two other AFC staff members who are here today who will be monitoring the Q&A, and they can either answer your question directly or they can flag it for me to discuss at the end of the presentation. Just another note about questions, this presentation is being recorded and will be put on our YouTube channel. And so if you have specific questions about your child's circumstances and you'd rather not have that discussed in the recorded segment, we will leave a few minutes at the very end to stop the recording and answer any questions that you might have, about specific circumstances. And then also just to note, at the end of this presentation, we will have a survey for you to fill out, where you would have to put, you'll have to, just answer a few questions, put in your email address. And so if you want a copy of the presentation, you will need to fill that survey out at the end in order for us to be able to send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation. So please wait for the end for that. Once I'm answering questions at the end of the presentation, we'll put that survey link in the chat so that folks can fill that out. So great, I think we have a good amount of people joining. So I can just probably go ahead and get started. Once again, for folks that maybe joined a little later, my name is Rohini Singh, and I'm the Assistant Director of the School Justice Project at Advocates for Children of New York. And today we'll be discussing accessing behavioral health supports in schools. And then just another note to just mention again, because I know this is something that often comes up, we will send out a copy of the PowerPoint presentation at the end of the training, usually tomorrow. Something to note is, in order for us to do that, it is important that you fill out that survey at the end of the presentation. And we will be sending the link to that survey when I'm answering questions at the end of the presentation. So you have time to fill that out. Great. So today we will be discussing how to access behavioral health supports in schools. And my goal today is to share some information about what supports are available to all students, what supports are available specifically to students with disabilities, and some of the rights of parents of students with disabilities who are trying to access behavior supports in schools, some tips and strategies when advocating for behavioral supports, and some problem solving if you're encountering issues trying to get support from your particular school. So first, for folks that are not aware, just by way of introduction, Advocates for Children is an independent agency that protects the education rights of all New York City students. Our mission really is to ensure that all students have access to a high quality education. And we provide a number of different services in our community. Our primary services are Education Helpline, which is open Monday through Thursday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. The number is here on the screen. It's 1-866-427-6033. And if any parent, student, community member, school staff member can call and speak to an education specialist and receive answers to really any education related question. We also have a number of guides and resources on our website. And you'll find, and I'll reference some of the guides and resources that are particularly helpful when you're trying to advocate for behavior supports. But that is also an important resource so that, to reference at the end of the presentation. We also do a number of workshops and trainings for parents, schools, students, community members, so that parents are aware of their rights when it comes to the education system, the special education process, a number of different areas. And then the bulk of our work is providing free legal services to low-income families in New York City. So first, let's turn to discussing the need and some of the definitions of social, emotional, and behavioral supports. So social emotional learning is the process through which all people acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal or collective goals. It helps people, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. I want to give this context, and it's important to know this context because schools are not just responsible for providing students with spaces of academic learning, but also for social emotional learning and development as well, because these types of skills are important skills for any student to be learning in school. It's also important to note that our emotional and social well-being affects how we think, how we feel and act, and helps determine how we handle stress and relate to others and how to make healthy choices. And so, as I mentioned, these are really our necessary skills for life, and so also necessary skills for schools to be teaching children and for students to be learning in school. So why is this important? This is really crucial because there are countless studies that show that unmet social, emotional, and mental health needs can have a significant impact on students' learning. Student social, emotional, and mental wellness is correlated with an increase in grades, attendance, self-esteem, overall child's health, and a decrease in absenteeism and emergency use for mental health services. In addition, as I'm sure many of you have been following in the news, and it was outlined recently in a recent Surgeon General's advisory. There's currently a youth mental health crisis occurring in the United States. And so it's really important now, while we're in this period of time that we as a society and recognize the importance of social emotional support, mental well-being for our students. It's also really important right now, because we as a society and many individuals in schools and classrooms have also experienced significant individual and collective trauma these past few years. And just to give a quick definition of trauma, trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual and or community. It can be physically or emotionally harmful or threatening, and has lasting adverse effects on the individual or community's functioning and physical, social, and emotional well-being. And so trauma can really impact the way that we respond to future events. And it's important to keep that in mind as we discuss behavior supports and how to advocate for them for students. Oftentimes traumatic responses, are really difficult to control. And then also, given that a lot of the events that have impacted our young people have also impacted parents, have impacted school staff. It's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about and thinking about supporting students in schools. And so let's turn first to discuss the ways to advocate for students that do not have IEPs or Individualized Education Programs, which is the plan that's developed to meet the needs of students who have been identified as having a disability. So not every student that is experiencing behavioral challenges or in need of behavior supports will need an IEP. And there are resources and supports that are available universally to all students that parents should be aware of. A threshold question is, to just think of when you're thinking about accessing behavioral supports is, how do you know if your child or student needs behavior support or social emotional support? When students are in need of support in the development of their social emotional skills, usually it's because there's some sort of externalizing behavior like acting out in school, maybe they're being suspended or disciplined or removed repeatedly, things of that nature. But not always, it can also potentially be internalizing behaviors. Really any change in behavior should be a flag for you to think about, okay, should I be advocating for more behavior supports for my child? So there are a number of different school-based supports, as I mentioned, that are available to all students. And so first, I want to turn to talk about at-risk counseling. So any parent can ask a school to provide at-risk counseling for their child if they're in need of additional behavior supports. At-risk counseling is offered on a time limited basis. It's usually from 8 to 12 weeks. And it's for students that are struggling with specific circumstances. It's not mandated, so because there's no IEP or 504 plan, and it's usually just provided as needed. It could be with the school social worker, guidance counselor, or school psychologist. There are also some just general informal behavior interventions that you could be advocating for your child. These would be implemented, in the classroom by a teacher, by a guidance counselor, by a classroom para if there is one. And again, maybe for a limited time period. This could be something like a behavior contract or chart, a conduct card, attendance monitoring, some sort of points or reward system. Having the student use a signal to take a break and see a school counselor, establishing a formal check-in at the beginning or the end of the school day for the student, things like that. And I'll go into more detail in the tips and strategies portion of the presentation about some of these behavior interventions that might be helpful depending on a student's particular needs and circumstances. But this is, a student does not need an IEP in order for a parent to request behavior interventions, and things can be implemented in the classroom even without an IEP, by communicating with the teacher, guidance counselor, or school staff members about your individual child's needs. Another school-based support that exists for all students is a crisis de-escalation plan. And so all schools have what's known as a crisis de-escalation plan. This is required under the Chancellor's Regulation A411. And the Chancellor's Regulation requires that every school has a crisis de-escalation team that develops a plan each year that includes strategies for de-escalating behavioral crises, identifies locations in the school building where students in crisis may be safely isolated from others, identifies any school staff trained in de-escalation techniques. It has to identify in-school and community resources available to the school and the parents, and describes how crisis de-escalation and response protocols are communicated to school staff. This is really important to note, especially if you're working with a student or your child is experiencing a lot of behavioral crises in school. And if the school's response, which unfortunately is what we see in our work is often a school's response, is to call 911 or call EMS. This Chancellor's Regulation requires that there be a plan in place prior to doing that and identifies specific staff members, specific training, everything that I just mentioned. And so if your child is experiencing a lot of behavior crises within the school, and the school's response is one that is either punitive or one where they're calling EMS repeatedly, then it is important to request a copy of the school's crisis de-escalation plan, review it, find out what the missing link is, like why it's not being implemented, why they're not able to implement the de-escalation plan. In addition to these specific types of supports, there are also a number of school-based mental health services that are available in various schools. And so every school has some type of mental health support for students. Unfortunately, it looks different in every school. And it could be anything from having access to a mental health specialist or consultant who works in central DOE to help train staff or provide assistance on individual cases, or having access to crisis intervention staff during emergencies, or some schools actually have a mental health clinic on site at the school. For a list of the different supports available by school, I have a few slides a little later where I'll describe how to look up what mental health supports might be available in your individual school. In addition to school-based mental health services, some schools also have students in temporary housing community coordinators or single shepherd success mentors who help support students. These are assigned to schools with the greatest concentration of students in shelters and help support youth in temporary housing. Not all schools have this level of support, and so it's important to ask if you're working with a student, your child is in this particular situation, if they do have access to this level of support for students. Excuse me. A little bit more about school-based mental health services. So there's a link on this slide, which again will be distributed at the end of the presentation, to a list of the different DOE programs when it comes to school-based mental health services. As I mentioned earlier, not all of these are available in every school, and I'll go into a little bit later how you can determine what is in your individual school. But the different supports range from school response clinicians, who are licensed social workers who provide support for students facing crises across the city, and is meant to reduce the practice of school staff calling 911. They could provide care for students in times of immediate emotional distress, including intermediate on-site clinical counseling and connecting students to long-term care if necessary. There's also school response teams. This program is only in 28 schools in the city, and these teams provide crisis support and interventions, including assessments of individual students and recommended services, staff trainings, mental health referrals for families and students. There's also a school mental health specialist program. And these specialists are trained to deliver trauma-informed group work with students. They also provide mental health education to caregivers and school staff. There's one specialist for up to 5 schools. These were formerly called mental health consultants. And they should be able to provide some direct student services. And so if you're unsure, again, you can ask your school administration, the parent coordinator, if the school is connected to a mental health specialist, and they could potentially provide some additional support for your student, for school staff, some additional training when it comes to supporting a student you're working with or your child. There's also the School Mental Health Prevention Intervention Program, or the PIP program. This is only in 42 schools. And this program is designed to help schools assess the need for mental health services within their building, partner with community providers, and set up school-based programs. And they should be able to offer crisis support and interventions and trainings for students. There's also a number of schools that have a partnership with a health and hospitals clinic. So schools with health and hospital mental health clinic partnerships, also known as the Pathways to Care Initiative. And this is where students under 18 can get diagnostic evaluations, ongoing therapy, medication management, and other clinical services. And these sessions can be done at a clinic or via telemental health in the school. A school or a parent can make a referral for a child, and it's sort of a fast track to mental health care through an H&H, a health and hospitals clinic. There are also a number of schools, and I know this number has been expanding over the years, that are a number of schools that are considered community schools. And these community schools, some of these community schools do offer mental health services and behavior support services. And so if your school is a community school, you can contact the community-based organization that is partnering with your school to determine if they offer any sort of interventions or supports that can help with a child's behavioral needs. Finally, there are also schools that have either a health center with mental health services, or, as I mentioned, a mental health clinic. And these schools, could provide a full range of services. The mental health clinics could actually provide, evaluations, family or group therapy, medication management, crisis intervention, 24-hour crisis support, things like that. The health centers with mental health services, they might be able to provide therapy, potentially not medication management or psychiatric services. Great. So how do you find out, what supports are available within your child's school? And so this is a recent addition to school websites, I think just as of this school year. Each school has a DOE website, and that lists the specific mental health supports in each school. And so if you go to schoolsearch.schools.nyc and type in the name of the school or address, and any other information you have, like the borough or the specific grade, and then hit enter, you'll be able to find the specific school's New York City DOE's website page. And so on that page, you'll see this home screen. And if you look down here, you'll see a section labeled mental health and wellness. And so if you click on that, you'll see the specific supports that exist within each school. So this was just a school I picked at random. You'll see here under the mental health and wellness tab that this school actually has a school-based mental health clinic. And so that's listed here. And that it's also a community school. And so you'll see here both the number for the specific hospital that is running the school-based mental health clinic. And then you'll also see the contact information for the provider that is partnering the schools to make it a community school. And so this is the way you'll find out if the particular school your child attends has one of those mental health supports, school-based mental health supports that I just mentioned. And again, these are supports that should be available to all students. Something to note just in general, and something that I mentioned earlier is that, oftentimes when a student's experiencing behavioral challenges, the way that you'll be aware of that or it'll manifest is if a student's being repeatedly disciplined. I wanted to make sure I point out at this stage, and I won't speak too much about this because we do talk about this in more detail in our Navigating School Discipline and Suspensions webinar, which is on our website and on our YouTube channel. But the new discipline code that was amended in September 2019 takes a new approach to discipline. The code's mission statement makes it clear that the DOE is embracing progressive discipline, which seeks to correct student behavior through counseling and other school-based interventions, such as restorative practices, and does not seek, just to punish or suspend students. And so, the code itself talks about how when a suspension or removal is warranted, the school should start with responses that keep students in their school and actually address the underlying reasons for the behavior. And so, we feel this is really important. It's really important to hold, schools and the DOE accountable and use this language to your advantage when you're advocating for your child or for a student that you're working with. Within the discipline code, all New York City elementary schools must provide some sort of social emotional learning to students, and all middle and high schools should have access or should have some support in implementing restorative justice practices. And again, this is a really important thing to note that all students should have access to and something that you could advocate for in an individual school. Restorative justice is an intervention that replaces punishment and focuses on repairing relationships. Again, it's all about addressing the underlying issue and not just punishing or suspending a student. There are different types of restorative practices. There's collaborative negotiation, circle process, peer mediation, conflict resolution, formal restorative conferencing. And the research and the studies really show that it can greatly improve the student's behavior. It lowers the incidence of repeated misbehavior and contributes to a more positive school environment by fostering respect for one another. And so again, this is just a support that's important to be aware of, especially if your child or a student is being repeatedly disciplined for behavior, to point to the discipline code and say, the discipline code itself says that you should be addressing the underlying reasons for the behavior, that the DOE embraces progressive discipline, which should be focusing on, again, responding to the reasons for the behavior instead of just punishing a student. And then finally, it's important to know that in the last 2 years, the DOE has really emphasized social emotional learning during COVID, and has, in the 2020-2021 school year, made an announcement that they were focusing on building community and resilience in schools. All staff are going to, or should be at this point, trained in trauma responsive educational practices. The activities will vary a little bit based on the age and the grade, but the DOE really has been emphasizing strengthening partnerships with community-based organizations, with different providers that can help schools and students navigate this specific time and build their social emotional skills and learning. And so again, if your student is really struggling, it's good to reference this plan, to reference the fact that the the DOE is saying that they're providing all these supports, and really push the school to identify like who are they partnering with, where can you get support, how can they help you access supports for your student. Great. So now I'm going to be turning to talking about supports for students with disabilities. And the remaining supports, as I mentioned, are just for students with IEPs. And I'm going to be mostly focusing on specific behavior supports that you can request if your child, if they're experiencing behavioral challenges, so that they can remain in their current school environment. But it's important to note that, depending on the individual circumstances, depending on the nature of the issues or the challenges that they're experiencing, that your child might require a new school environment or a more appropriate school placement, depending on their individual needs. If you feel as though your child's school is unable to support your student's behavior, I really encourage you to watch our special education webinar and read our special education guide, so you know your rights when it comes to when it comes to special education, when it comes to evaluations, identifying what is an appropriate placement for your child. I should say just generally, I want to say that with a caveat that, in our experience, there are limited options for placements for students that have behavioral needs. Often what we see and what I imagine many of you experience is that students that are experiencing behavioral challenges are often referred to New York City's specialized school district, or District 75. And while this particular school placement might be appropriate for some students, it's not necessarily going to be appropriate for every student. And we believe that schools should be providing more behavior supports in District 1 through 32 settings, so that students can remain in less restrictive environments. Just as a note, on a systemic level, like we are doing a lot of advocacy around trying to get more behavior supports in schools for students so that they can remain in less restrictive environments. Last year, the Department of Education launched a pilot program called the PATH program for young students experiencing behavior needs. But that program is, I believe, only in one school at this time, and we're not sure if it will be expanded in subsequent years. So just in general, if you're a parent, a professional, an advocate, given that there are limited options, requests to the Office of Special Education for more DOE programs, services, and supports for students with behavioral and emotional disabilities could be really helpful, just so that they know the extent of the need and of the need for more support for students. It's also important to note here that that all students with IEPs, no matter what their classification is, are entitled to behavior supports. So sometimes we also see that some students or families are told that, a student's classification must be changed to ED, or emotional disturbance, in order to receive certain supports. That is not accurate. Again, if a student is experiencing behavioral challenges that are impacting their learning, they should be entitled to supports whether or not they have that classification. I also just want to flag that, the New York State Education Department is proposing to rename the ED classification, given the offensiveness and the inaccuracy of that term. And so if folks aren't aware of that, I just wanted to flag that for you. Great. So let's turn a little bit and talk about how different behavior supports for students with IEPs. So there are many different supports that you can advocate for when it comes to students that have IEPs, and different supports and services and strategies, which I'll talk about in the next section, that you can try to incorporate within a student's IEP. But just for context, and so that folks know and understand this, within the IDEA and the implementing regulations, it states very specifically that the IEP team must, in the case of a child whose behavior impedes the child's learning or that of others, consider the use of positive behavior interventions and supports and other strategies to address that behavior. And so we really can't emphasize enough that behavior and social emotional support is a part of learning. And for students with IEPs, it's a part of what constitutes a free, appropriate public education. And so, we often see students that have IEPs and students that have IEPs and their classification might be learning disability or speech and language impairment, and they're being repeatedly suspended or disciplined. And they come to us and we look at the IEP and there's no mention of the behavioral challenges that they're experiencing or facing. And that's a big red flag for us. And so, it's really important that no matter what a student's classification is, their behavioral needs are part of their special education needs, and there should be supports and services to address those needs in order for them to be receiving, the appropriate education that they're entitled to. Right, and so some of these, and as I mentioned, so positive behavior interventions and supports are some of the strategies to address student behavioral needs. There are functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans, which I'll describe in more detail in a little bit. Some other supports such as paraprofessionals, staff training and support. And so there are a number of different supports that you can advocate in a student's IEP. There's specific assistive technology, equipment such as sensory items, or a weighted vest for a student that might have specific sensory needs. You can request and ask for, as I mentioned, specific behavior supports like a paraprofessional or a behavior intervention plan. Putting in the IEP and specifically putting in, either management needs sections, in the management needs section, to allow for time for to consult with providers, teachers, and paraprofessionals to discuss particular behavioral strategies and supports. Changes to the types of needs, types of services to meet a student's needs. So changing timing or frequency, depending on, when a student is experiencing behavioral challenges, things like that. And regular check-ins with social workers, guidance counselors, et cetera. For IEPs, again, these are just some specific things that you can ask for from the school in order to better support your students' needs. Just in general, just a reminder, I think we can't emphasize this enough, that if your child or a student you're working with has a clinical team outside of school and they're receiving some sort of therapy from a mental health provider, we do think it is really important to try to connect the provider from outside of the school with the school to help figure out what types of interventions might work for the school, for the student in the school setting. Many young people also have additional staff in their lives, like crisis intervention or care coordinators who work with behavioral strategies with a parent in the home. And so it's important to really make those connections to see if those strategies can carry over into the school environment as well. Next, I'm going to turn to talk a little bit about functional behavior assessments and behavior intervention plans. So the idea behind a functional behavior assessment, and really just in general about behavior, is that any student behavior is, or I should just say, not just student behavior, any behavior that any of us sort of engage in is done for a reason, right? And so, children behave in certain ways for a reason, and we call that reason the function of the behavior. And so it's impossible to address any unwanted behavior without first determining the behavior's function. And so a functional behavior assessment is the assessment that a school should be doing in order to determine what the function of the behavior is. And the goal is to give the child, the student, the tools in order to behave well and to use positive strategies in order to do that. And so the first step in the functional behavior assessment is to identify the target behavior. So specifically what behavior needs to change. And then it's to perform the assessment, to do multiple observations in a variety of settings and times throughout the school day over multiple days to determine when does the behavior occur, where, how often, or for how long. And in order to do this, some of you might be familiar with ABC charts. It's essentially trying to figure out, what happens immediately before the problem behavior, and then what happens after. And so this is done through a series of observations, typically by a school staff member, to determine, again, what the function of the behavior is. So why does the behavior occur, or why is the student engaging in this behavior? And then the purpose of this is to create a the team has to use the information from the FBA in order to create what's called a behavior intervention plan, or a BIP. And the BIP, the purpose of it, again, is to prevent and address the behavior and to promote positive behavior. So a school should be taking the data from the FBA and putting it into a BIP. And the BIP has to be focused on strategies to prevent the behavior from occurring. So it can't just be, a consequence, or it can't just be, like a statement that says the student will not act this way. The FBA should be identifying what the reason behind the behavior is, and then the BIP should be providing specific strategies to prevent the behavior from occurring. There should be strategies to manage the behavior, and then there should be strategies to measure progress. And so again, it should have these specific steps on how, the student will build skills to manage their behavior, how school staff will help, either if there are changes in the environment, changes in the way that they approach a student, how school staff should be approaching a student that's engaging in behavior. And then it should have some sort of schedule to measure the effectiveness of the intervention strategy. So it must be continuously revised and revisited depending on what is happening during implementation. Unfortunately, we know, a lot of students have FBAs and BIPs, and sometimes they are not effective. And so it's really important to go through, if your child does have an FBA, BIP, to go through and make sure that it does contain all of this information, and that it does have specific strategies that are working for the student. And if those strategies are not working, then, there should be a meeting to discuss the effectiveness of the FBA BIP, and to work through some of the reasons why it's not effective or not working. An FBA BIP is considered, the BIP is considered part of a student's IEP. And so in order to request one, you would request one the way you would request a special education evaluation. And so to make a request in writing with the school-based support team, and sign consent, and the school is required to do it within the time limits that they're required to do special education evaluations. Something to also note, if a BIP really is not effective, something that you could advocate for in an IEP is for specific staff training on different types of behavior techniques or different types of behavior supports. Because it might be that, while the plan might be an appropriate plan for your child, that maybe, the way it translates in the classroom is it might not be implemented correctly. And so, schools might need some sort of coaching or implementation support, and that's something that you can advocate for in an IEP meeting to be put in an IEP. Great. So now I'm going to turn a little bit to talk about specific tips and strategies. Again, just as a reminder, I'm not a clinician, and we at AFC, we are not clinicians, but these are some tips and strategies that have been recommended to us by clinicians that we work with, and some strategies that have worked with students that we've worked with who are in need of behavior supports. These are strategies that you can request to be made a part of an FBA BIP, or to be placed within an IEP, like in the management needs section. Or if your student doesn't have a disability, these are just, as I mentioned before, like those informal behavior interventions. These are just some strategies that you can ask the teacher, a different classroom or school staff to implement, even if a child does not have an IEP. So just some general behavioral management tips. What studies have shown is that it's important to set clear, consistent, and reasonable expectations for students, to provide choices. Kids get bored, and so it's important to be flexible. To validate your child and yourself. Validation is communicating that thoughts, feelings, and behaviors make sense given your child's current circumstances, and it does not necessarily mean agreement. And so often we find, schools will, when a student is experiencing a behavioral challenge, the immediate response will be, to try to correct that behavior, or to impose some sort of disciplinary response. When sometimes, validating the underlying feelings behind the behavior can be really effective again, better understanding why a student is acting in a certain way, and then coming up with strategies to address that behavior. Some specific behavior management tools that are particularly effective, use of a visual daily schedule, cognitive breaks between tasks, movement breaks, verbal and visual cues for directions and staying on task, use of a behavioral contract, a behavior chart or a reward system for appropriate behavior, consistent use of positive reinforcement. So, as I mentioned, not just reacting when a student's acting in a way that is not appropriate, but to really focus on praising behavior that is appropriate, and focusing on that. Daily teacher feedback to a student or a parent about a student's behavior. These are all specific behavior management tools that you can ask for from either to be put in an IEP or just from a school generally, if your child is experiencing behavioral challenges in school. This is just a sample daily schedule, and these slides are in here again. We'll send out the slides at the end of the presentation. But this is one example of a daily schedule. Here's another one for school-age children with some visuals. And then some common de-escalation strategies for students. It's important, it's important these are de-escalation strategies, I think, that are helpful in general. To stay calm, to give a student a choice, to encourage the child to use a coping strategy, to show that you're listening, and to validate the child's thoughts and feelings. And again, these are all things that can be put in some sort of crisis de-escalation plan, an interim crisis plan, or within a student's IEP. Some strategies for children with language difficulties. So use of a visual schedule, use of a timer or visual countdown system, using first then statements can be particularly helpful. And so, encouraging a student to first do an activity, maybe a non-preferred activity, and then allowing them to do a preferred activity, offering choices in a visual format. Some examples here on this slide. Some strategies for children with attentional difficulties. So creating a simple list of instructions, using praise, creating a reward system, using consequences effectively, and establishing some sort of structure to a student's day. Some specific strategies for children with low frustration tolerance. So completing tasks one at a time, beginning with less complex tasks with fewer components, returning to mastery or a task the child can successfully complete, offering choices to a student, and providing scaffolding, encouragement, and praise. Strategies for highly active children. So movement and motor breaks are often very key here. The use of fidgets that are small and silent, setting clear rules and expectations for behavior. And then some strategies for children with anxiety. So using coping and calming strategies. So listening to music on headphones, deep breathing, or watching a preferred video clip. Promoting the use of active positive coping strategies through modeling, co-participation, and discussion. Engaging in exercise and physical activity, and offering choices again. Great. So now we're going to turn a little bit to problem solving when it comes to asking for these behavior supports for students. And so who should I reach out to in the DOE if I want to make requests for these supports? And so we always encourage parents to start with the school, to talk to the parent coordinator, the principal, the school-based support team, to make their initial requests through the school environment. And then if that doesn't seem to be working, the next step is to go to the superintendent's office. You can speak to the family support coordinator, behavior specialist, director of student services, and administrator of special education. We would normally say, and this is where things are a little different this year and changing, often we relied pretty heavily on the borough offices, which is where the directors of student services and the administrator of special education used to sit. And borough offices also had access to behavioral specialists who could provide more support for schools to try to navigate, or to try to offer specific strategies for a student that is having a lot of behavioral challenges. The mayor just recently announced that they're going to be closing the borough offices, so we're not actually sure where we're not sure where the behavior specialists will go and where they'll be housed. But in the meantime, the new administration is encouraging families to use the superintendent's office for this purpose, and so that is a good first point of contact when you're trying to get more services and supports. And then finally, if you're not getting enough support from the school, if the superintendent's office is not providing you with the type of support that you need, then reaching out to DOE Central, the Office of Special Education. And so either calling this number or emailing specialeducation@schools.nyc.gov. These can be particularly helpful, sources in order to try to help schools problem solve and get more supports, so that they can provide your child with the supports they need to address the behavior. Some just other, problem solving tips, be politely persistent, it might require a few emails, a few phone calls in order to get someone to listen and someone to provide you with support and to push the school to provide your child with support. If the school is really struggling to figure out how to help, suggesting that they reach out to someone in Central, behavior specialists that exists within the DOE Central, someone that can provide them with more support. For teachers, the UFT actually on their website has a lot of resources and can provide support for educators on how to implement behavior support and behavior support strategies. Just keep a paper trail, make sure that you keep copies of emails and text messages, keep a list of the contacts that you've spoken with, as well as, some dates of the conversation with school staff. It's really important, as I mentioned, especially if your child has an IEP, to keep track of all this, because it is, a school has an obligation to provide a child with an appropriate education. And these behavior supports are part of that education, are part of what would make a particular school appropriate. And so, these types of requests are important to keep track of, so that, you can then navigate and enforce your rights at a later time if the school is not providing you with the support that your child needs. So when to call AFC. So if a school just will not recommend any new behavior supports, that's particularly troubling if they're sort of like unwilling to work with you, unwilling to provide different strategies for a child. If they're saying that they just can't meet they haven't done anything and they're saying they just can't meet your child's needs, and maybe making a referral to a placement that might not be appropriate, things like that. If the school is saying that it can't consider any changes to an IEP or any additional supports until evaluations are conducted, that is also something you can call us about. That's also a red flag. If your child is removed from class, suspended from school, or otherwise disciplined, again, and this, I cover this a little bit more in the in the Navigating School Discipline workshop, but it's important to know that students that have disabilities cannot be disciplined or suspended for behavior that is a manifestation of their disability. And so they do have additional protections and rights in the suspension and discipline process. And so, you can call AFC and we can give you some more information and provide you with more support on how to navigate that. Great. And that is my presentation. I don't know if anyone has any questions. We will leave the Q&A up. Great, it looks like we had one question that came in. So the question is, how would you support a child who is physically aggressive? And so this is a very good question, and I don't know if I'll be able to provide a specific answer to this, other than to say that, as I mentioned before, I think what's really important to try to determine is, what the function of the behavior is. So the why behind the behavior, because I think it's in order to adequately address behavior, in order to know what type of support that they need, it's important to know, like what is triggering the behavior, and what happens after, like what's reinforcing this type of behavior. And so I feel like, sometimes it's difficult to provide specific answers to these questions, because some of it will depend on a specific, on an individual student's needs. But, I think the first step, if a student's experiencing a lot of, physical aggression, is to request that functional behavior assessment if they have an IEP, or if you are interested in pursuing an IEP, to request that functional behavior assessment to get a behavior intervention plan in order to determine, and to get through a series of observations, like what is the reason behind the behavior, what's happening before, what's happening after, things like that. And then also to, physically aggressive is a very general term, and it's a very general term. And these observations can be helpful to clarifying like what is actually occurring, what is the behavior, things like that. And then I think I have a follow-up question. Would you ask the question about this? Would you ask the child about this behavior since they are young aged, or the FBA is for this? Do you need an IEP to request an FBA? So would you ask the child? So I don't know if I can answer that first question. I think that might be a question, more of like a clinical question. Yeah, I think it just depends on the specific child's circumstances and, how old they are and their developmental needs. And so I don't know if I could say yes or no to this. And do you need an IEP to request an FBA? So an FBA is, it is a special education evaluation. And so once you make the request for the FBA, it will sort of start the IEP process. And so yes, so you don't need to have one already to make the request for the FBA, but it would sort of start the process to get an IEP and a BIP in place. It might be possible to ask for an FBA and to not have an IEP implemented. That has not been our experience and not been something that we've done, because I think when a behavior gets to the point where it needs an FBA, often what happens is a student really does need and is at the point of needing more support, and would be eligible for an IEP. Great, I see we have a few more questions here. I don't know, Liliana and Karen, I can read them out now since we have time, or did you want to answer them?
I just answered one of them. What I would suggest is that we continue to the end of the presentation and then close the recording and answer these questions. What do you think?
Sure, that works. Yeah, I'm happy to do that. And so let us, maybe so what I'll do is, before I go to answer these questions, what I'll do is, I guess Liliana or Karen, if you could put here we go. For copies of the slides, if you could put the link to the survey in the chat. So everyone now, if you could look at the chat, there is a link to our survey form for you to quickly do an evaluation of the training, and to give us your contact information and your email address so that we can then send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, and get just some basic information from you about your experience of the training to help us do better in the future. And then what I'll do is we can, I guess, stop the recording portion, and then I can just answer the questions that have been coming in through the Q&A. And you could we are still, we still have 5 more minutes. And so if you're still here and you have specific questions, feel free to keep putting them in the Q&A, and I can go through them and answer them with folks. Great. Okay. And so should I stop? I guess, Liliana, are you able to stop the